Today we're going to be looking at Legends of the Space Marines. This book is a compilation of 10 short stories, each of a different chapter written by a different writer. Now, if you're new to Warhammer or the Warhammer universe in general, this book might be a little confusing depending on which story you're reading. I'm assuming if you got the book, you're going to end up reading all of the stories. The thing is, some stories are more generic than others, and they'll be okay if you're just trying to get into a good story. Others, you'll need to know a little bit about the lore behind the Space Marines. Not too much, but some of it. I've noticed that I had to do research on one or two stories just so I could really understand what was going on. Now, don't let that scare you away. Some of these stories are really good and they're worth checking out. Now, if you're a fan of the Space Marines and know a lot about their lore, and specifically about some of these chapters that are in this book, you'll notice that some of these stories have connections to other stories you might have read about these specific chapters. Some of which I haven't read, but made me very interested in reading a lot of those novels. But let's start talking about the stories. Now in this book, we're going to read stories based off Black Templars, Dark Hunters, Doom Eagles, Flesh Tearers. Terrors? It's spelled T-E-A-R-E-R-S. So it's Tearers, right? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Mantis Warriors, Salamanders, Size of the Emperor, Space Wolves, Ultramarines, and White Scars. Now I'm just going to do a brief overview over each story just to try to keep the video time down. But I will point out some major events that I personally find very interesting in some of the stories. So let's get started. The first story we're looking at is called Hell Knight, written by Nick Kime. I think that's how you pronounce his name. If you haven't noticed, I have troubles pronouncing some names and words. I'm sure you guys would correct me in the comments. Now, Hell Knight is a story that revolves around the Salamanders. Now, starting off the book, nothing too interesting, but nothing too bad at the same time. If you read other sci-fi novels, this story doesn't really separate itself well enough and stamp itself in the Warhammer 40k universe. But if you're a Salamanders fan, and if you're familiar with the stories, you'll see several recurring characters in this story. So if you're a Salamanders fanboy, you might really enjoy that. And from what I'm told, this story actually links to another Salamander story that deals with almost the same thing. It's just a different event that's happening in the same story. But let's move on. Now, our second story is called Cover of Darkness, written by Michael Scallon. It's going to be a recurring thing with me mispronouncing everybody's name, isn't it? Now, this story is based on the White Scars. Again, nothing too overly interesting, but it's not a bad story. The basic premise of this story is a squad from the White Scars are out on a hunting mission. They're looking for a particular target and they're hunting this guy down. Now, I didn't know much about the White Scars going into this, but I did find out that they are pretty good in stealth, which is kind of odd because I know they wear white armor, and they're doing night missions in this white armor. Then again, if it's pitch black, it doesn't really matter what color your armor is because you're not going to be seen, but I digress. But nothing overly interesting. I'm not sure if this story links into another story, so let's move on. Our third story is called Relic, written by Jonathan Green. I know I pronounced that right. And this story revolves around the Black Templars. Now, I didn't know much about the Black Templars going into this. I did kind of know that they are like super zealous when it comes to their faith, or something like that. Now, I really like this story because it was written from the perspective of a dreadnought. Now, this is the first book I've read that dealt with Space Marines, and I didn't really know much about dreadnoughts. I just thought they were robotic machines. For those of you who didn't know, it's actually manned by a somewhat living being that is interred inside this robotic machine. So they still maintain most, if not all, of their personality and their own thinking process. So it's not a mindless machine, but actually another soldier, a very large, metallic, dangerous soldier. And let's face it, dreadnoughts are badass. And the squad of Black Templars are fighting on Armageddon. You might have remembered Armageddon from our last book, and it's a world that's in constant war and conflict with the Orcs and the Imperium. And the story follows the exploit of the squad that's kind of led by this dreadnought, and they find another ancient dreadnought that's buried in the ground. And I would go on, but I'll be spoiling too much. It is a good story, though. But let's move on to the next one. The fourth story is called 12 Wolves, written by Ben Counter. If you couldn't tell by the title, this story revolves around the Space Wolves. For those that don't know, Space Wolves, they're kind of like the Norse Viking version of Space Marines. The storytelling in this story is done very different from the other ones. For anybody who might have seen any movies based on Vikings or read books on Vikings or based off of Norse lore, might be familiar with the storytelling style of this story. Now, I wasn't really a big fan of how they was telling the story, but I loved the way and how it was changing up the way stories were told throughout this book. It's essentially a storyteller telling a story of the Space Wolves to the younger Space Wolves who are just moving up in the ranks of their chapter. And it's one of those stories that tells a lesson. The storyteller essentially is telling a story of a Longfang, which is a longtime veteran of the Space Wolves, and a Bloodclaw, who is kind of like one of their newer members. I wouldn't quite say rookie, but maybe just above rookie. And the Longfang is trying to teach the lessons of the 12 wolves to the Bloodfang. And each wolf has like a different morality or a different style or a different code that the Space Wolves follow. And that I really like. Okay, our next story is called The Return by James Swallow. This story is based around the Doom Eagles. Now, I don't know much about the Doom Eagles. This story tells a little bit about the Doom Eagles, mostly about how they follow their codex, or their way of thinking. It tells a story of a Space Marine of the Doom Eagle chapter who returns to the chapter after being missing for X number of years, but he's been labeled as dead in their archives, and that poses a problem. Now, I was kind of torn with the story, not if it was a good or not story. Now, I thought it was an okay story, and I love the way how they go into sort of the way the Doom Eagles hold to their beliefs, even to a fault. Now, whether or not you like their beliefs, that's up to you. But the story kind of shows the struggle that the Doom Eagles hold by trying to adhere to their beliefs and trying to do what they might believe would be the right thing to do, even if it might go against their beliefs, and trying to work around it somehow. I don't know. I'm not doing a very good job explaining it. You just have to read it yourself. It's not a story filled with action. It's more like drama. If you like drama in your sci-fi, this story has more of that. Let's move on. Our next story is called Consequences, written by Graham McNeil. Now, this story is based on the Ultramarines, essentially the Superman of the Space Marines. I've heard them kind of labeled that. They also been kind of vanilla Space Marines. I don't know. I read some of their fluff. It's not bad. If you like him, you like him. If not, whatever. But the story was written very well, I thought. And one of the author's note on the story is, this story is set between the events of Warriors of Ultramar and the Dead Sky Black Sun. I'm sure all you Ultramarine fanboys know exactly what that means. I don't. But for those of you new to this, don't worry, you don't really need to know the events of that. This is actually one of the stories that got me interested in reading to other books to find out what really happened. Now, as far as needing to know those stories, don't worry. This story tells you just what you need to know so you can understand what's going on at this time. And again, similar to that Doom Eagle story I was talking about earlier, this deals with trying to adhere to your beliefs, or in this case, the codex, and following the rules, and dealing with the consequences when you break those rules. Reading the story reminded me a little bit of the Lethal Weapon movies, where the cops just don't follow the rules, but they get results. And something like this similar happens, where somebody breaks the rules, but he got the job done. The problem is, unlike those Lethal Weapon movies, you still have to pay for breaking the rules. And ultimately, it deals with, are you willing to take the consequences of your actions? Now, I learned more about the Warhammer universe, and especially how the Space Marines adhere to their beliefs and their codex and their rules. So I'm able to understand more why this situation occurred, or why it's such a big deal. If you're new, try going into it with a somewhat open mind and accept the fact that this is the way things are. Although in actuality, I'm sure you'll probably think of Lethal Weapon and think, well, they got results, so what's the problem? Anyway, our next story is called The Last Detail, written by Paul Kearney. Kearney? K-E-A-R-N-E-Y. You pronounce it. This story deals with the Dark Hunters. I don't know much about their chapter. This story definitely doesn't say much about their chapter. As far as I'm concerned, it's a fairly generic story. You can fit it with most other sci-fi novels outside of the Warhammer universe. Change a few names and it's perfectly fine. As far as sci-fi stories go, it's not bad. It works. I liked it. As far as a Warhammer story goes, didn't feel very Warhammer-ish. Now you do have the guys in big armor, big guns, and they do talk about the specific names such as the Chaos and Space Marines. But with this kind of book, you really miss out when you don't try to give a little bit of the background behind the chapter. It doesn't really do that with the Dark Hunters. And after reading the story, I still don't really know anything about the Dark Hunters, and I felt that the author really missed out on that. So, that being said, let's move on. Our next story is called The Trial of the Mantis Warriors, written by C.S. Goto. I'm going to go with Goto. Now, as the title suggests, it is based on the Mantis Warriors. Now, this is a story that I got really confused trying to read. There's a pretty big event that happened with the Mantis Warriors' history, and if you don't really know what that event was, you might be a little bit confused with the story. I had to read it a few times so I could really understand what was going on. This is the kind of story you probably want to go to Wikipedia and look up a little bit on the history of the Mantis Warriors so you can really get the gist of it. That, or maybe I'm just too slow to pick up on it. But I digress. The story, once you realize what they're talking about and what's going on, it's not a bad story, and it does reveal a good amount on what happened in that event that the Mantis Warriors were involved in. Essentially, if you know the main event on what happened, this story gives more insight into those events and why they happened and occurred. That I liked, but like I said, you kind of got to know what happened to begin with. Moving on. Our ninth story is called Orphans of the Kraken, written by Richard Williams. And this story deals with the size of the Emperor. Now, I didn't know much about the size of the Emperor. It did reveal a little bit about their background, and essentially on how they're a dying chapter. Something that happened to their homeworld, there's not many of them left, and they're trying to rebuild their numbers. This story deals with a sergeant leading a squad of new recruits. And they're not your typical Space Marine recruits. Since the Mantis Warriors are trying to rebuild their forces, they're not being really picky with who they choose. And really, that it sort of confused me, because I knew Space Marines were very picky with who they choose to join their chapter. But it seemed like the Mantis Warriors were getting a little bit desperate, and it was shown in the personalities of these recruits. It was a little refreshing seeing, even though they were recruits, I'm just going to call them Space Marines for this point, Space Marines that had more of a human attitude. They weren't as die-hard as most other Space Marines, and they're a little bit more immature, let's say. They were pretty young. Young meaning probably in the mid to late teens. Well, pretty late teens, really. But they acted how some teenagers with something to prove would act. I did like the dilemma that the Scythes were in. I did like their struggle they were trying to go through, essentially trying to rebuild their numbers, and how they were going about the process of doing it. Story is an okay story, in my opinion, but what I do like is how it reveals the mentality of this chapter. It's not a chapter I would play on the tabletop, but like I said, I'm more in it for the fluff. I love hearing the backstory. This one helps out a little bit, mainly about their mentality. Now, moving on. Now, our last story, and probably my favorite in the book, At Gaia's Point, written by Aaron Dembski Bowden. Here's the words. You pronounce his name. I'm pretty sure I got it right. Now, this story is based off the Flesh Terrors. I mispronounced it earlier. You heard it. You figure it out. Unfortunately, although it is one of my favorites, you do need to have some knowledge of the Blood Angels chapter. The Flesh Terrors, I'm going to call them Terrors, they're essentially a chapter that was created from the Blood Angels. And to keep things simplified for anybody who doesn't know, they're essentially berserkers. They have a bloodlust. There's something wrong with their genes, and they just go nuts. And the Flesh Terrors have that really bad, way worse than the Blood Angels, at least as far as the story goes. And what that means is, when they lose control, they become an unstoppable killing machine. They don't really see the difference between friend and foe. And after a while, they can't turn it off. And when they get to that point, it is the job of their fellow brothers in the chapter to essentially eliminate their brother. And this is a story in which something like that happens. Essentially, one of the brothers who are just completely lost in the frenzy breaks loose on this one planet, and he is being hunted down. Now, this guy is just so out of it. He's actually getting visions from, I'm trying not to put too many spoilers in here, but like I said, you do need to know a little bit based on their lore. You do need to know how the Space Marines were created just to understand what's going on with this guy. So I'm just going to be real quick with how they were created. Thousands of years ago, Primarchs, the most badass of the Space Marines, were around. They created the chapters. There was a civil war called Horus Heresy. The dude that was the Primarch for the Blood Angels and essentially the Primarch for the Flesh Tearers, something bad happened to him. His seed got corrupted somehow and affected the Blood Angels, and that's why they're Berserkers, and now it's affecting the Flesh Tearers. And when you go in complete Berserk, freak out mode, I can't control myself, this guy was getting visions. He was that dude. And what I really liked, like even the guy that was chasing him down, he would still feel this Berserker rage from time to time. But there was also this feeling that he didn't really want to kill his brother, but it's out of duty. He had to do it. And it didn't really make him happy to do it. And you really feel that, even when they confront each other. And coming to the end of the story, I felt really sad for these guys. I thought it was a really miserable situation they were in. But I thought the writer, he really did a good job presenting it, and he ended it very well. I really liked that last story, and I thought it was a great way to end Legends of the Space Marine. Now, for those of you who are already Warhammer fans and like Space Marines, this is a pretty good book, especially if you want to know more about some of the fluff of other chapters, or you just want to geek out over some of the side stories and from other stories you might have read on the chapters. For those who are new to the Warhammer universe, it's not a bad way to get into it, but like I said, you might need to do some research on some of these stories. And if you're willing to do that, there's a Wikipedia page for every chapter you could look up, and it wouldn't be a bad way to get into it. Some of the stories are really good, some are fairly generic, but overall I'll say it's a pretty above average book. Now that's my opinion about it. Take it for what you want.